You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Thank you, Peter. We're here, of course, not to honor Henry Manne, but we're here to honor one of the great towering figures of intellect in the world in the 20th and early 21st century, Jim Buchanan. We have a rather extraordinary panel, and one might say, what's a mere lawyer, law dean, have to do with anything like this? Well, I'll give you a little background. Jim Buchanan and I have a lot in common. First of all, we're both from Tennessee. Not many people know that. We both went to college in Tennessee. We both left Tennessee and went to the University of Chicago. As a matter of fact, we overlapped there. We were about the same time. And then after lots and lots of moves, we finally found our proper home feeling at George Mason. And we enjoyed quite a few years here together. My connection personally, however, with public choice theory and therefore with Jim began in 1962 when I read, to my utter amazement, a book called The Calculus of Consent. I was just totally enamored of it. And I said, you know, this is something that the lawyers and the legal scholars have been looking for and needing for a long time. And so I wrote a review of the book, which I'm guessing, because it wasn't easy in those days, 5 or 6 different major journals turned down. I was able to lean on my own local review at George Washington University to publish the review. And I can tell you, it is the only review ever written of that book in a law review. About 6 years later, I was a professor at the University of Rochester. Though teaching economics, I was in the political science department with Bill Riker and Dick Fenno. Fenno was then the editor of the American Political Science Review, and he too confessed that no political science review had reviewed that book. Well, with pressure from me and from Riker, that was remedied, and the rest is certainly the better part of intellectual history. There was one other similarity. Jim and, of course, with Gordon Tullock, in oversimplified fashion, you might say, introduced the great analytical power of economics to the field of political science, of political activity. I was very active, as Peter mentioned, in doing the same thing with law. And thereby, both those fields that had been extremely moribund intellectually theretofore came alive. They are very different fields today, each, I think, worthy of being in a university than they were back in the days before public choice theory. At any rate, I've had my say about law and economics, which is not otherwise noted on the program. And so to the more serious business that you're here for. Our first speaker Amartya Sen is the Thomas W. Lamont University Professor and Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Harvard University. From 1998 until recently, he was also the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge. In 1998, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his work in welfare economics and social choice. Dr. Sen is best known for his work on the causes of famine, and his research led to the development of solutions for limiting the effects of food shortages. It's my great pleasure to introduce Amartya Sen.
There's some technology needed here, I think.
How's that?
Is that any good?
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, all right, that's good. Thank you. Well, first of all, let me say how delighted I am to be here on this occasion. Jim has been a leading light in not only the thinking of great many economists across the world, but more personally, in my case, in my own thinking. So it's really a great honor and great privilege to be here at this time. I'm very aware that Jim Buchanan's followers, people influenced by him, come from many different schools of thought, and I would be surprised if everyone agreed with what I'm going to say. In fact, I would be very disappointed if that were to happen. And hopefully it wouldn't happen. Anyway, let me get going on the task. Then I'd like to thank Henry Manne for his kind introduction. I didn't get the point about the stable food price either, but perhaps someday you can tell me where you got that from. More than 200 years ago, in 1807, William Wordsworth wrote, I quote, "Every great and original writer, in proportion as he is great and original, must himself create the taste by which he is to be relished." I thought of this Wordsworthian remark as I contemplated the different aspects of the greatness of James Buchanan. His originality has been so striking and so far-reaching that it is easy to identify his greatness with any of his many powerful contributions. Depending on your own priorities, you can try to place Buchanan's greatness in contributions. So depending on your priorities, you can try to place Buchanan's greatness in contributions such as the founding of public choice theory, or generating an understanding of the demands of constitutional thinking, or clarifying the connection between markets and liberties. In an obvious sense, each of these answers, and there are several others, would be a plausible diagnosis of the greatness of Jim Buchanan. And yet, none of these distinct answers, pointing to specific contributions, nor the totality of such answers, can quite capture the way Buchanan has enriched economic, political, and legal thinking. Buchanan has, in addition to all this, created a profoundly important taste, in the Wordsworthian sense, for sophistication in social thought, particularly in relation to the role of public discussion and of human interaction in society. If the importance of institutions, which Buchanan has emphasized throughout his life, is one of the bases of this cultivated taste, Buchanan's persistent pointer to the interaction between people is certainly another. Let me use the short time that I have in commenting briefly on the role of a major hero of mine in pursuing this line of reasoning even though, as I already mentioned, I'm very aware that no one assessment of Buchanan's outstanding achievements, seen from any perspective, will satisfy all others to whom Buchanan is also a hero. But for what it is worth, here is my take on the task that I have been given. Let me begin by invoking not so much Frank Knight and Knut Wicksell, who were Buchanan's own heroes, but the much earlier enterprise of what is now called the European Enlightenment. As it happens, Knight and Wicksell actually do fit into that long history. Many Enlightenment thinkers in the 18th century, from Adam Smith and Immanuel Kant to Marquis de Condorcet, wanted a society in which reasoning rather than faith would be supreme, and in which public reasoning would be one of the principal aspects of human interaction. The origin of the expression government by discussion, describing democracy thus, may be attributed to Walter Bagehot or to John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, but that is also what Smith and Kant and Condorcet were substantively seeking in the previous century through their own political philosophies. However, taste for and the acceptance of public reasoning are not easy to achieve. While Smith and Kant remained largely academic thinkers, Condorcet, who also was a practical activist, failed in his attempt to generate a tolerant and interactive society in France, so much so that he himself was threatened with the imminent prospect of execution during the reign of terror following the revolution. He chose to take his own life before others could do the killing. James Buchanan's leadership in social thinking, of which his pioneering role in establishing the new discipline of public choice theory is a part, has been deeply concerned with creating, through argument as well as advocacy, a climate of public reasoning. This has not only been a major line of emphasis in Buchanan's own writings, it has also helped to give shape to his other commitments, for example, to democracy, to liberty, to constitutional political economy, to the use of market economy, and even to the understanding of the basic principles of public finance. His efforts have not been aimed to establishing some dazzling new theorem or analytical result, but with changing the entire climate of social decision-making. Let me illustrate the connection involved by commenting in particular on the relation between Buchanan's public choice theory and Arrow's social choice theory. The Marquis de Condorcet did pioneering work, along with other French mathematicians like Jean-Charles de Borda, on the analytical and mathematical aspects of interpersonal aggregation. And it is to that the Arrowian social choice theory traces its early ancestry. But Condorcet was also deeply concerned with public reasoning, which could change people's views and priorities rather than taking their preferences, which are to be aggregated, as being simply given. By clarifying the role of that momentous engagement in a truly outstanding pair of articles in the Journal of Political Economy in 1954, and I still remember my thrill when I first read these as a student, Buchanan immensely enriched the subject matter with which social choice as well as public choice has to be centrally engaged. In contrast with Arrow's initial inclination, as Arrow himself put it, I quote, to assume that individual values are taken as data and are not capable of being altered by the nature of the decision process itself, unquote, Buchanan insisted that, I quote, seeing democracy as government by discussion implies that individual values can and do change in the process of decision-making, unquote. It can be claimed that it is only through Buchanan's expansion of Arrow's departure that we can do justice to what we may call the Enlightenment enterprise of advancing rational decision-making in societies, which lies at the foundation of democratic modernity. At the risk of some self-indulgence, let me illustrate the relevance of this issue by referring to a subject in which I've been myself involved. One of the striking features in the history of famines in the world is that they never occur in a functioning democratic society. In explaining this empirical phenomenon, it is not adequate to point to the fact that democratic voting procedures give potential famine victims a vote which could bring a government down if the government did not take adequate steps to prevent famines. The complete inadequacy of this explanation lies in the fact that only a very small proportion of the population is struck by a famine, typically 5% or less, almost never more than 10%. In my 15 years of studying famine over the centuries and across the world, I've never come across one which affected more than 10. I think the Irish is probably the largest. We ever had Irish 1840s. How can such a small proportion of voters acting according to their own self-interest become such a potent force in preventing famines through electoral democracies? The theory of majority decision will have absolutely nothing to offer in providing an explanation here. There's a particular need in this context to examine value formation that results from public discussion of altogether miserable events, in generating sympathy and political commitment on the part of citizens to do something to prevent the occurrence of such disasters. It is that process which is an integral aspect of the role of public reasoning that Buchanan has emphasized and made us understand, which makes democracy as government by discussion a central aspect of the prevention of disastrous social events such as famine. So we have to turn to value formation rather than given values, majority decision, to seek an explanation. I can give many other examples. In considering this example, it might be tempting to think that this Buchananian line of reasoning in terms of value formation through public discussion works only by denying another, allegedly Buchananian precept, to wit, taking human beings to be fixated only on the pursuit of self-interest, particularly drawing clue from parts of the calculus of consent. Is the domination of self-interest in human behavior not another basic principle of public choice theory, advanced by the same Buchanan? And is that not a necessary part of seeing the role of market economy for generating economic efficiency? Is this not then some self-contradiction in Buchanan's own integrated position? This line of questioning arises, I believe, from a total misunderstanding of Buchanan's sophisticated reasoning about human behavior and social interaction. Buchanan takes human beings as they are and as they reason and interact with each other. And in this picture, self-interest does indeed play a role, because we have reason for self-interest in many contexts. But it's not the only influence on human behavior. To say that, and I quote from Buchanan, a model of self-interested motivation necessarily becomes acceptable to a degree, unquote from Buchanan, which is adequate in showing the place of egoistic incentives in human behavior and this is an important point, in generating market efficiency, does not require us to assume, as Buchanan himself points out, I quote from him again, this is from Freedom in Constitutional Contract, self-interest as commonly understood, this is Buchanan, self-interest as commonly understood, or even utility maximization in its broadest sense, can support the explanatory burden placed upon it by, it does not require you to assume, there's a negation there, can support the explanatory burden placed upon it by the most extreme of modern economic imperialists, unquote. Self-interest, so this is not something which is needed and is not something that he's subscribing to, indeed he is denying. Self-interest pursuit is seen by Buchanan as only, quote-unquote, a part of human motivation, which is in fact all that is needed for the markets to work. This is a point that's quite often misunderstood, because this whole idea that you have a entirely self-interest, no other motivation, in order to explain that markets work, is a complete caricature of the reasoning that enters in economic decision-making in any field, including in the market economy, a point that Adam Smith knew with crystal clarity, and so does Buchanan. And indeed, as Buchanan goes on to explain, I quote from Buchanan again, this position allows me to accept, with Aristotle and with everyone else, that man is indeed a social animal, and also to accept, with Adam Smith, an important role in human action for sympathy with fellow human beings, unquote. There is thus no need for any willing suspension of disbelief in seeing the role that Buchanan gives to incentives, and no need to make human beings the base and narrow-minded creatures that they emphatically are not. If the taste that Buchanan contributes to advancing is one of human broadening through public interaction and reasoning, there's nothing there that goes against the rightful recognition of the place of markets in society, on which Buchanan rightly insists. That place must not be confused with giving it a solitary role in creating a good society, or even an efficient economy. To the extent that a market economy cannot deal with a problem which may demand other interactive institutions, there is again no tension in Buchanan's overall position. As he puts it, I quote from Buchanan again, the market economy, basically as described by Adam Smith, is a necessary part of the social order. Note the point that is necessary rather than sufficient, that being said. Indeed, perhaps its most important part. But the economy cannot function in vacuum. It must be incorporated in, and must be understood to be incorporated in a structure of law and institutions, unquote. The choice and functioning of these other institutions remain again as part of social decisions to be taken through public decision and social interchange of a kind that Buchanan has discussed in many places, including in the Freedom in Constitutional Contract. I take the liberty to remark at the end of this presentation on what I believe to be an important aspect of Jim Buchanan's work, that the social engagement on which Buchanan has placed his focus and for which he has developed a taste, tried to develop a taste, and with some success, because it's a very hard problem to generate a taste for public reasoning, is particularly important to bear in mind in solving the problem the world faces today. Whether we are concerned with global warming or other environmental challenges, or with the crippling unemployment that we have in some economies today and a stalled global economy, the need for interactive public reasoning has never been stronger. And I don't mind acknowledging as a social choice theory. You even mentioned that I got a prize connected with that, that it is to Buchanan's leadership in that we have to look for the fulfillment of what I take to be the Enlightenment vision of how to create a great world. The cultivation of the taste for public reasoning in an open-minded way, which Jim Buchanan has done so much to advance, is one of the features of his greatness, for which economists and other social scientists, and indeed the world at large, have much reason to be grateful. I feel very privileged indeed to be here in honoring Buchanan today. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Professor Eleanor Ostrom. She is the Arthur F. Bentley Professor of Political Science and Senior Research Director of the Workshop in Political Theory and Policy Analysis at Indiana University in Bloomington. In 2009, she received the Nobel Prize in Economic Science for her analysis of economic governance, especially the commons. Dr. Ostrom was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1991, member of the National Academy of Science in 2001. She is past president of the American Political Science Association and has been the president of the Public Choice Society, the Midwest Political Science Association, and the International Association for the Study of Common Property. Dr. Ostrom has served on numerous advisory and editorial boards and has been a consultant for various task force committees. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Eleanor Ostrom.
Thank you very, very much. It is an honor for me to be invited here, and I greatly appreciate the opportunity. I think Amatra and I will be doing the philosophical end and the empirical end, and we'll be talking about Jim's influence. See, his influence is across everything. And so I am very glad to share my deep obligation to the contribution that James Buchanan has made to all of our lives. Jim affected my life in many ways. One, his scholarship has affected the way I've thought and the foundation for an immense amount of empirical work. And I'm going to deal with a little bit of what that's led to in a moment. But I also want to mention that his graciousness has been appreciated upon many occasions, especially in my early career. Women were not always treated graciously, and I deeply appreciated that Jim did not make a distinction in the way he treated Vincent Ostrom and the way he treated Lynn Ostrom. Buchanan and Tulloch wrote a book that was one of the major influences in my graduate program, and on my dissertation, and on my entire empirical work ever since. I was studying at UCLA, and it was a very interesting group. I got used to working with economists and political scientists back and forth, and did quite a bit of formal work in economics, even though some people deny that. But we had Charlie Thibault and Dwayne Marvick and Jack Hirschleifer, and a vigorous debate going on back and forth, reading a great deal of Buchanan's work and others. They were struggling to understand how citizens could solve problems in urban areas. And there was no presumption among any of these colleagues that citizens were dumb and unable to solve problems. And that has come into our literature later than what Jim started off and has continued, and is always looking at the role of citizens. In fact, Thibault and Vincent Ostrom worked very hard to try to articulate why having a single large government unit serving a metropolitan area was not conducive to either self-governance or efficiency. And if we go back to page 114 of Calculus of Consent, as you can tell, I I really had more conversations with Jim than he realized, given some of this. But on page 114, there's a comment. Both the decentralization and size factors suggest that when possible, collective action should be organized in small rather than large political units. Organizations in large units may be justified only by the overwhelming importance of the externalities that remain after localized and decentralized collectivization. Boy, if I could get that up on the wall of every university I visit and get it into the textbooks on public policy and urban governance, I would be thrilled. Somehow we have forgotten this core idea and forgotten that, a lot of people, students come in and they ask, what is democracy? And they say, it's voting. Democracy is defined by voting for officials, not by people being engaged in constitutional decision-making. And people have lost the idea of a constitution. Some of my students come in and think, well, that's just a piece of paper written by dead old white men at a national level. And the idea that citizens would craft their own rules and really struggle with how to get things organized at a local community as well as all the way up has been lost. And so I'm here to appreciate Jim and to tell all of the young people in this audience, go forth, teach his work, and there's a lot of empirical work now that supports it. And I'll go over just some of that briefly, but this is really important. What we have now is a pretty intensive research program that has looked at the concept. Growing out of this was the concept of polycentricity, and the term has confused many people. But the idea was, okay, if you have a small unit that does have some kind of things like a school district or a local park or any of a variety of things that could be organized at a small level, there are other things in the same area that need to be organized at large. And they're not competitive. If you have a polycentric system with small, medium, large, and very large, then you may be able to have the calculus of consent developed and worked out. And our research has shown this to be very important. One of the places that we were able to do studies was on policing in urban America. I've kidded people sometimes that I've ridden in more police cars than I think most people in the audience have done. I visited more jails. And I've seen the ways that police officers who are in a community where local people have constituted it, the way they deal with citizens is different than when you're in a metropolitan area police department, huge one, with 350 or 500 officers. And they are not seeing themselves as responsible to citizens. They have a union, they have certain hours. There's just an entirely different mentality. And if you're in a police car for 8 hours with officers serving these areas, they don't know the area. And whenever I would be in a police car with an officer from a small department, they would start telling me, now, over here in this park, this is where a lot of the kids play, and we're nervous now. There's starting to be a problem where there are some gangs forming, and they're watching. They're watching early. They sometimes will take someone to someone's home in order to discuss it. They don't put them in jail like this. In the big cities, it's put them in jail right away. And the problem of putting young people in jail instead of trying to figure out how to help them become real citizens and become a real part of a democratic system is just dramatic. So we have an immense amount of evidence. On the front of, well, we have to have large because there are economies of scale. the presumption is that people who are local officials held accountable to citizens won't figure that out. Again, there's some smart people out there. We're not part of them. The citizens aren't part of them. If they come in and they figure it out, and somehow we've just got to get in our teaching the work of Buchanan early so that students learn about the role of citizens in making rules, collective, constitutional choice, but constitutional choice for a neighborhood, constitutional choice about that neighborhood park where there are problems. So now what do we do in terms of which parents start to go there at what time so that we're sure that we have parents involved in that local park? That's constitutional choice to decide what rules we're going to use, et cetera, about a local park. And they can be good examples for your students to try to understand where people have those ways of organizing and where they don't. Obviously, one of the other places that there's been immense confusion is something called common property. There for a long time, especially after Garrett Hardin wrote his Tragedy of the Commons, the presumption was that you had private property and you had government property and anything else was nothing. And people called it common property. They didn't recognize that if you call it property, that does mean that some people have some rights, but the term common property meant nothing. And then the presumption was that in light of people having nothing, they couldn't work their own way. They were trapped and couldn't work it out way. And we've had recommendation after recommendation to have thought very large that they're challenging in this as the way to protect nature. And yes, some very large reserves make very good sense. But what we're finding, we've just finished, not finished, but we're working on a study of 256 forests around the world. And we are looking at the factors that affect whether the forests are more sustainable and regrowing. And you'll be very surprised at the factor that comes across time after time after time as one of the important ones. And it's whether the people who are being served, supposedly, living around, think it important enough to invest themselves in monitoring. So what it means is that the kind of long-term interest that you get here, that citizens can have a really long-term interest in something if they have some control over it. Then if they have some control, and we find if they can harvest at least some things, they have a long time horizon. And with a long time horizon, they're then much more interested in maintaining and monitoring and keeping that system going. When they have no long-term time horizon, some big guy comes along with a big truck and a lot of money and it says, what's the best way into the forest, and I'll give you X if you'll be quiet. And they're quiet. They don't, they have no long term. They're not citizens. And we're consistently making people not citizens. And I keep getting people to read Buchanan so they understand what it means to be a citizen. And I think I'll stop there because we want to give Jim an opportunity. But if there's anyone in this room who has not read I probably have not read all of Jim's work. He's written so much, I probably couldn't read it all. But if we're going to be talking about the sustainability of a democratic system over time and real empirical findings about that, I think Jim Buchanan's work is absolutely foundational, and thank God I read it as a graduate student and have been reading it ever since, because I wouldn't be here tonight but for that. Thank you very much.
Eleanor said she wouldn't be here but for that.
No,
if I hadn't written that review of Calculus of Consent and gotten to know Gordon Tullock and Jim Buchanan, I wouldn't be here. because it was they who recommended me to the then president of George Mason University as the dean for their law school. So I owe a special debt. James Buchanan is, as you know, professor of economics at George Mason and winner of the 1986 Nobel Prize in Economic Science. Best known for developing the public choice theory of economics, which changed the way economists analyze economic and political decision-making, not just economists. Dr. Buchanan's work opened the door for the examination of how politicians' self-interest and non-economic forces affect government economic policy. As the Royal Swedish Academy of Science Foundation noted when it awarded the Nobel to Jim Buchanan, Buchanan has transferred the concept of gain derived from mutual exchange between individuals to the realm of political decision-making. I won't read the rest of it, but engrave those words on your minds. Jim, we'd like to hear your comments.
Thank you, Henry. I'm very glad to be here. That's the literal case in my But I'm not going to say very much at all. I appreciate very much the fact that Amartya Sen and Lynn Ostrom have agreed to come and give this talk, and I appreciate their remarks in every respect. I've known both of them for a long time. Lynn was, of course, one of the early founders, so to speak, of public choice. She and Vince Ostrom were there along with the rest of us early on before we called it public choice, before much happened. And we appreciate her being here, and I was very thrilled when she was awarded the Nobel Prize last year. And we've all followed her work on the Commons. She really has affected the literature a great deal. As far as Amartya goes, I remember I've known him since probably in the 60s. I'm not sure. He would know maybe early 70s. But I remember I first met him at a conference in Siena. Two things I remember about that conference was I remember Joe Stiglitz running around with a bunch of sniveling kids and his first wife, Charlotte, and before he broke up. I remember the difficulty they were having with those children around that conference. And then I also remember that we went to some kind of musical performance down in Siena, and we were supposed to meet to go back to the hotel back to the monastery hotel at midnight, and most of us got to the bus, and the rest of them were not around, and we sent out a working party to go bring them back, and the working party also joined the others drinking in the bar. So I remember those things about that conference. But what I have remembered Amartya Sen for, I have watched him through the years. At that time, he was a social welfare function maximizer of the first order. I've always thought of him as to be one of the relatively few amongst my peers in economics who really makes up his mind on the basis of the argument, on the basis of the reasoning of the arguments, rather than coming at it from a preconceived position. And I do think that he has understood my work and my critique of Arrow better than anybody else, really. I think his presidential address to the American Economic Association spelled that out in some detail. And, I learned from it. Now, for the first time, I began to see and appreciate the other side of that argument. I had never done that before, and that was a good contribution to my own intellectual development, so to speak. So I'm very pleased that he's here and have continued to be interested in what he does. I don't know how he does so much, as a matter of fact. That's hard for me to say. I had know very little about this whole affair we're in today. They've kept me out of it. Maybe it's appropriate that I have been kept out of it. But I don't know what I was supposed to do and say in this occasion. But I'm very pleased, as I said to start with, I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm pleased that Henry and Amartya and Lynn are here, and I think that's a great honor for me to have that happen.
And our next speaker has a job that is job description best summed up in 2 words: herding cats. That's what the president of a university does. Since Alan Merton became George Mason's 5th president in July of '96, George Mason has become the fastest growing university in Virginia and gained national and international acclaim for a number of significant initiatives and achievements. Prior to coming to George Mason, President Merton was dean of the Johnson Graduate School of Management of Cornell and has held numerous academic appointments in both engineering and business in the United States, as well as academic and business positions in Hungary and France. He serves on the board of directors of the Greater Washington Board of Trade, Northern Virginia Technology Council, a real estate investment trust, mutual fund trust, and a banking institution. He's got some problems these days. He was previously chair of the National Research Council's Committee on Workforce Needs and Information Technology and a member of the Virginia Governor's Blue Ribbon Commission on Higher Education. President Merton has been recognized for his contributions to the Northern Virginia technology community and as a leader of the Greater Washington, D.C. business community, as well as for promoting volunteerism and service to the community. Great pleasure to introduce Alan Merton.
Welcome to George Mason University. Welcome on behalf of over 33,000 students. It is truly an honor and privilege to be the president of George Mason and to be able to participate in events such as this. I want to thank Professor Ostrom and Professor Sen and the people from the Liberty Fund for contributing to this truly important event at George Mason University. Over the last several years, as we designed this building and then it was being constructed, every once in a while someone would pull me aside, looking for a sanity check, and said, "What are you building that building for?" The answer is this kind of event. Looking out at all of you and listening to the questions, the discussion I had for the last 15, 20 minutes is the reason we build this building. Obviously, many other uses of the building are going to occur beyond academic events, but this is the main reason for what we have done here at George Mason University. This is truly an exciting university, and now we have a venue in which we can do even more. Having the microphone gives me a chance to say a few things about 2 of my favorite people. The first one is Henry Manny. Henry Manny has done more for George Mason University than many people will ever understand. What Henry did to take the law school from a very almost humble beginning to a law school that was first regionally and then nationally and in international perspective has made an enormous difference, not just to the law school, but to the entire George Mason University. Thank you, Henry. I congratulate all of you, particularly the Liberty Fund, for recognizing Jim Buchanan and for what he has done for George Mason University, what he's done for academia in the United States and beyond, but what he's done in so many respects in terms of taking very complex topics and explaining them and understanding them in a way that is truly unique. Jim Buchanan is a unique individual. When we look at the life of George Mason University, still a very young university, it's the arrival of Jim and his receiving of the Nobel Prize that was really the first big star in terms of what was happening at George Mason University, and we believe a predictor of what could and then what has happened at George Mason University. Jim, thank you for everything that you've done for this university.
The next speaker, Dan Hauser, is chairman and professor of economics at George Mason, where he also directs the Interdisciplinary Center for Economic Science, an experimental economics and neuroeconomics research center founded by Nobel laureate Vernon Smith in 2001, and lately of George Mason. He is also editor-in-chief of the Journal of Neuroscience, Psychology, and Economics, and serves on the editorial boards of a variety of scientific journals. Dr. Hauser has published extensively in economics, psychology, and general science journals. He is known for his research on the role of reputation, emotion, and emotional expression. His publications have provided fundamental contributions to our understanding of markets and their connections to cooperation in human groups. Thank you. Dan?
Thank you very much, Henry. It is indeed an honor and a privilege for me to share this stage with this group of distinguished scholars who have come together today to honor James Buchanan. One surely cannot overstate Jim's importance to George Mason University or the crucial impact that he had in creating prominence for our economics department. Jim and his colleagues at the Center for the Study of Public Choice moved their scholarly activities to Mason in 1983. And why did Jim make his choice? Well, he made it in part due to the spirit of entrepreneurship that he found at Mason. And that is a spirit that continues to characterize our department and this university, and that is largely because Jim came here with his amazing colleagues and promoted those ideas and those that way of producing scholarly activity. Moreover, in moving his center to Mason economics, Jim and his center colleagues provided a crucially important early impetus for our department's rapidly and continually increasing visibility. And that played an exceptionally important role in fostering the department's as well as the university's international reputation for scholarly excellence. Now, Jim found substantial productivity in his new home. During his first years at Mason, he made important additions to his established constitutional political economy research program. That's the program, of course, that would lead to his Nobel Prize in 1986. And in addition, he was inspired to begin new research with his center colleagues on norms, on the anti-commons, and on increasing returns to scale, in addition to a variety of other areas. Well, that's a tremendous amount of energy. And it's no surprise that in light of that energy, that scholarly energy, he became a significant attractor of students, funds, visitors, all of which made the center and the economics department, and indeed this university, a more interesting place for all of us to spend time each day, and a much more productive place for our joint scholarly research activities. Ultimately, having that sort of energy, intellectual energy around, it's why we come to work each day. It's what makes it fun. And Jim and his amazing colleagues at the Center for the Study of Public Choice provided that initial seed for what became and continues to become our department. But it's worth noting that, in addition to this, Jim helped sort of on the practical side of what we have to do. Jim has been extremely giving of his time in helping Mason and the department in sort of fundraising activities. He's attended all sorts of university events. He's lent his name and his Nobel Prize to a wide variety of efforts in this regard. And for this generosity, surely we are all very grateful. But we're here, not just to recognize Jim, of course, Jim's contributions to Mason and to economics, but of course his lifetime of extraordinary scholarly achievements. And of these, there are many. We've heard the distinguished panelists speak of many of these. He's helped us to better understand externalities, the burden of the public debt, the logic of clubs, the importance of increasing returns, and many other specific points that all of us as students of Jim continue to strive to absorb. So there's all of that, but I have a bunch of students, some of whom are on the market. In fact, 2 students that I have on the market this year are here in the audience now. And what I tell them, and what we tell all of our students, is you need a message that you're going to take to your grandfather, to your grandmother, to your mom and dad. The message that is going to sort of bring it home to them. Why are you doing what you're doing, right? What's sort of the thing that impacts with that group, right? In addition to the deep scholarly points that we've heard brought up today, as well as Charles Rowley's question earlier, the question of the day. These are deep and important scholarly points. But what's the sort of grandmother point? Well, I think that Don Boudreau, who was previous chairman of this department and currently is the director of the Center for the Study of Public Choice, he and I were chatting about this at one point, and I think he and I agree that one sort of message of this type that comes out of Jim's work is that political activity ultimately does not fundamentally differ from market activity. Jim's work has the important message that all of us can understand, that we need to avoid being distracted by labels and by superficial appearances. Politicians might very well be called public servants, but being steeped in Buchananism, we understand that the root motivation of public servants is no different than the root motivation of corporate CEOs, lumberjacks, taxi drivers, or college professors. A bureaucracy might be called the Consumer Product Safety Commission, but being steeped in Buchananism, we look not at its name, but at the incentives that are faced by its operatives to judge how likely this agency really is to promote consumer safety as opposed to other goals. It's an important lesson that we can all understand. By challenging us to understand that exchanges take place not only within conventional markets, not only when exchanges are mediated by money, but instead are ubiquitous and many-faced phenomenon of human action, Jim Buchanan expanded the scope and the subject matter of economics intelligently, creatively, and in ways that continue to resonate with exceptional importance to all of us. So, thank you very much, Jim, for all you have done for our department, for our university, and for our profession. We all wish you the warmest and most sincere congratulations on this award.
The next comment represents something I take particular pleasure in. One hears a vast amount of about money going from the government to universities to support work of one sort and another. I can tell you that on a productivity basis, that government money doesn't begin to match up to what the private sector and the foundations of this country provide. None, I think, has been more significant in this regard than the Liberty Fund of Indianapolis. Our next speaker, Chris Talley, is the president and CEO of the Liberty Fund, a private educational foundation established to encourage the study of the ideal of a society of free and responsible individuals. The foundation develops, supervises, and finances its own educational activities to foster thought and encourage discourse on enduring issues pertaining to liberty. And it has been notoriously successful in that regard. That's an aside. Prior to leading the Liberty Fund, Mr. Talley served as president and CEO of the People's Loan and Trust Company in Winchester, Indiana. He has served on the board of trustees at the Winchester Foundation for 30 years, is currently the board's chairman. He has been on the board of directors for the Pierre and Enid Goodrich Foundation for 20 years. I might add that Pierre Goodrich was the founder of the Liberty Fund, and he has acted as treasurer since 1992. It's a great pleasure to introduce Chris Talley.
Thank you very much, Henry. I appreciate that, and those kind words for Liberty Fund. We very much do appreciate that. So to Mr. Chairman, distinguished panelists, Professor Buchanan, and guests, it is indeed a privilege on behalf of Liberty Fund to participate in this day's activity and the celebration of the works of James Buchanan. When I took the proposition for Liberty Fund's involvement in the day's activity to our board of directors, they received it very warmly and approved it very enthusiastically and overwhelmingly. So we're delighted to be here. Liberty Fund owes a debt of gratitude to Professor Buchanan, and I'm going to talk very briefly about the reasons for that. Professor Buchanan was one of the first people to be involved in Liberty Fund's program when we became operational in the mid-1970s. In fact, he was one of our most active participants in our conference program, occurring mostly during the first 20 years of our operational activity, having participated in some 100 conferences over the tenure up to the current date. He was first involved as an author in a symposium held in 1975. I believe it was in June. The title of that symposium was Individual Liberty and Government Policies in the 1970s. His second conference, which he participated in as a conferee, was entitled Economic Planning in the American Constitutional System, which in fact was directed by Professor Henry Manning. During the late 1970s and in the early part of the 1980s, Professor Buchanan and his colleagues were actively involved in a series of Liberty Fund conferences with a variety of topics for discussion. These conferences were not only beneficial for Liberty Fund's educational purpose, but they were very instructional and instrumental in helping us set out how our program should be run and help provide a template for how the conference program has developed and continues to develop today. 2010 is the year of our 50th anniversary of Liberty Fund, having been founded officially on August the 18th of 1960. I mention this because as a part of the celebration of this 50th anniversary, we decided to replicate the first 10 conferences that were organized and by Mr. Goodrich, our founder, and he participated in 9 of those, was involved in the organization of the 10th, and then passed away a few months before the 10th one was exercised and executed. And I mention those, and I want to mention the common themes that ran through those 10 conferences as we've replicated them this past year or so, and just to give you a sense of the relevance of what Mr. Goodrich was concerned about 50 years ago to today. Those themes could be generally described as power and the corruptive influences of power, education, war and international relations, and money and monetary inflation. I think you would all agree with me that those 4 general themes are rather topical in the current environment. I would also like to mention, again, because of the timelessness of these titles or these topics, 5 of the conferences in which Professor Buchanan was involved, some as a writer of a paper, some as a participant. And just mentioning those 5, I'll give you the titles, and I think you'll see the relevance for today. Federal Fiscal Responsibility in March of 1976, Wealth Redistribution and the Income Tax in January of 1977, The Burden of Government. He was an author of a paper in that conference, which was in August of 1980. The Moral, Ethical, and Economic Foundations of Capitalism, which was conducted in February of 1981. And the Constitutional Constraints on Government, which has been mentioned on the panel here just this afternoon, in June of 1981. So you might say, the old cliche, the more things change, the more they stay the same, and it makes all of us at Liberty Fund want to work even harder and promote the educational purpose for which our foundation was established. Most recently, and most appropriately, Professor Buchanan attended a conference about a year ago in September of 2009, and it was most appropriately entitled James Buchanan's Constitutional Liberty. I was also involved in our publishing program. Early on in 1979, we published his book, What Should Economists Do? And then as Professor Betke mentioned in his opening remarks, the collected works of James Buchanan, as published by Liberty Fund in 1999, is at the back of the room. I'll break for a commercial. Get your orders in early and get them in often. We'd be delighted to supply any of you. We have them in stock and they're ready to ship if you'd like to avail yourself of that opportunity. We were delighted with the proposition of being able to reproduce these works and as I said, are delighted and are pleased to make them available to you. It's entirely appropriate in other ways that we be involved with this program, and it's entirely appropriate that these Buchanan collected works appear under the Liberty Fund aegis. Not only is there a long-standing association between Professor Buchanan and Liberty Fund, as I've just mentioned, but there's also a centrality of liberty as an organizing principle in Buchanan's writings. As Professor Manning indicated, Liberty Fund was established to explore the ideal of a society of free and responsible individuals. Professor Buchanan's work undoubtedly has been devoted to precisely this exploration. And for that, Professor Buchanan, Liberty Fund is forever grateful.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank everybody. This has been quite an occasion. They didn't inform me very much about this at all, so I'm kind of winging it in all respects at this situation. In particular, I didn't understand until I got a rumor last night that there might be some substantial pecuniary aspects. So I don't know quite what to do now, and with the stipend here, I appreciate it very much and understand the importance that this is. But I am reminded of a situation of two institutions that I've been involved with that has some relevance, and perhaps I should take their advice and emulate them. I was in the Navy, of course, in World War II, and in the Pacific, spent most of my time at Pearl Harbor. And the Officers Club at Pearl Harbor made a good profit from their bar. When all the ships came in, the boys would spend a lot of money drinking, and the Officers Club would accumulate profits, but they didn't know what to do with the profits. So what they did, every 2 months they'd throw a huge party with free drinks. And they'd use up their profits in that direction. Well, I found out also, I was later associated in Cambridge for a year with Sidney Sussex College, and the colleges there have a tradition, goes back to the medieval times, in which they have an audit feast every year. An audit feast is when they take an audit of the college's finances. They find out those who have made a profit will throw a big feast, and so they call it the audit feast. And so they spend all the profit that the colleges make by having these feasts every year. And as a matter of fact, as a side note, let me say that I've only twice in my life been to a white tie occasion where I had to put on the white tie. Once was, of course, the Nobel ceremony. The other was when I was invited to the audit feast over at Trinity College by Sir Dennis Robertson. That was quite an occasion for me. Anyway, so maybe I should just have a big feast and invite everybody here and send this stipend. But I can find better uses for it, I'm sure. But I must admit, as you get to be 90 and almost 91, on several dimensions, the types of expenditure you would like to do personally are no longer possible for me. But let me say one or two things that I think there's some relevance, especially to the relevance of this particular Center for Study of Spontaneous Order or Spontaneous Coordination. I do think that we have failed as economists to teach that simple lesson. My professor, Frank Knight, again, used to say, economics is really very, very simple. But once you get to the point where you can understand that it's very simple, it takes a long time to get there. And a great many economists have never got there even yet, even though they call themselves professional economists. To understanding how the spontaneous order of the marketplace works is, I think, a great achievement if you can purvey that to your students. That's really all we ought to do. We ought not be fooling around with a lot of these intricacies. But and that's very important to understand how a market works. But the market doesn't work everywhere, always, all the time. And I think one of the mistakes that was made, a huge mistake that was made, was the attitude that became so widespread and so widely accepted, was this notion that the market works in all respects and without its own laws and without being constrained by laws and institutions that are proper. The University of Chicago magazine a year ago featured an article, a lead article called "Is Chicago School Thinking to Blame?" And it was using the Chicago school thinking in the context of that article was this view that the market works in all respects. The view associated with Fama and really goes back to Lucas and the rational expectations and all this stuff. I do think that had more influence on a lot of the thinking in the leading up to the financial crisis than we give it credit for, perhaps. And I wrote a paper that I gave in Richmond in June to the effect that there's an old Chicago school and a new Chicago school. And the old Chicago school, which I associate myself with, thinking of Frank Knight and Henry Simons in particular, they would never have countenanced the view that the market works under any and all circumstances. The market works only if it's constrained by proper rules and proper constraints. And that idea was simply lacking or missing. And I think we must recognize that the market cannot generate its own rules. Laissez-faire will work given the constraints if they're properly drawn, but laissez-faire or leaving it alone will not generate its own rules. And that has to be because rules, by the nature of them, as several of us mentioned a long time ago, rules are themselves kind of public goods in the Samuelsonian sense. They're collective goods. We all live by them. We all have to be involved with them. So you can't expect a market with ordinary entrepreneurial activity to generate the rules. And so I think that gives you an explanation to some extent of how we were so complacent. Not only economists, but everybody else was so complacent as these new financial instruments were developed. And somehow this sat back in our rocking chair and said, well, the market will work it out. I think that was just a fallacy of major import. And perhaps had we recognized it and had economists recognized what was going on, they might have been able to change that set of attitudes. So that's my current sort of line of inquiry that I'm trying to do right now, a research program on this. We're kind of working on it. So I think there's more to be done. I do think that the damage has been done, of course. The great crises need not have happened had we paid attention and had we put in the proper constraints early on. But I don't trust the government enough now to put in those constraints, and so we're liable to do more harm than good with what we try to do in a corrective way. So we're suffering the consequences. And that's the reason, go back to the earlier question, the reason I am a bit pessimistic looking forward, looking at the objective reality. And I think I want to correct Henry on only one point. Jeff Brennan and I wrote 2 books together, not one, 2 books together. So, and thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.